Well, it's come to pass. Press is going to coach his boy.
And he turns a 3-23 team into a 14-12 team. Pretty big turnaround. And Pete averages 44 points a game. Thing is that Press figures for LSU to have a chance to win, Pete's got to shoot 40 times a game, which violates every principle of team basketball and all the precepts that made Press a great coach in the first place.
Except the contradiction is consistent.
Yes.
And what about his recruiting? Did he have any players to play with?
Oh, yeah. He recruits guys. The number one requirement is, can you play with my kid? So what he winds up recruiting, and some of it is by default because, great players are not going to go to LSU.
So they're not going to get the ball. Well, they're not going to be part of the offense.
They don't want to play in a cow palace. That's the first thing. It's not basketball country. But he pairs Pete with a team with two basically 6-foot guards, very good ball handlers, good players, but they're 6-foot guards. And they know how to play with Pete. One of the guys, Jeff Tribbett, he played with a phenomenal scorer, Rick Mount, in high school, so he knew how to give it up. The other guy, Rich Hickman, is from Aliquippa, Press and Pete's hometown. So it's kind of all in the family there. What happens is, they do rise substantially in the standings. I said from 3-23 to 14-12, which LSU had not been above 500 in quite some time. But more than that, they create a level of excitement really never seen before in the SEC. They're drawing 15,000 people in Tuscaloosa at Alabama. They create a level of excitement never before seen in the SEC. They're drawing huge numbers of fans in places most people haven't even heard of basketball. Athens, Georgia, Tuscaloosa. All of a sudden, these places are really excited about basketball.
Do they get better basketball players coming to their school?
Before, the SEC was basically Kentucky as far as national powers. But now the SEC is drawing notice from around the country. One of the things you need to bear in mind, particularly about SEC basketball, is that it was still segregated. And when Press comes in, he makes it clear that he's going to recruit black players. And he tries particularly hard with Harold Sylvester, who's a high school star in New Orleans. And as Bud Johnson recalls, a reporter calls the LSU president and says, is it true that Press is recruiting black players? And he says, oh no, I think my coach was misquoted. And that was the end of that. So there's always, a question as to whether or not Pete is really competing on a level playing field. He's not. He's not. The playing field is in fact skewed in his favor because he is playing in a segregated league. What Press does is he schedules teams outside the SEC. They play Duquesne. They play Oregon State. Eventually they'll play St. John's. They'll play in a variety of holiday tournaments. They'll play, all over the country. And Pete will be seen. And there will be a demand for Pete to be seen.
And that's how he's getting the national exposure.
Yes.
Which takes it to a whole different level.
By the end of Pete's sophomore year, he's far and away the top scorer in the country. Press is consumed with his scoring average. But he's also used the scoring average and Pete to sell the program and to sell the SEC. And Sports Illustrated on March 4th, 1968, comes out with a cover story on Pete and Press. It's written by Curry Kirkpatrick. And that really crystallizes the notion of pistol for the country. That's what people will remember for a good long time when they think of pistol. That codifies the image. The socks, the hair, the co-eds love him. So against the backdrop of the late 60s, the crew-cut dad and his beetle-haired son became national figures. And there was a name for what they did. It was called Showtime.
If you remember this, in warm-ups, Pete would put on a show. in warm-ups. And of course, when you played, you never looked at your opponent.
Right.
But of course, we were all doing this as we were, watching Pete do his thing. But I can see those black shoes, those low-cut shoes that he wore, and he was standing out on the foul line, and he'd be doing this and going between his legs and over his shoulders, and the guys would be just shooting we'd be shooting our normal layups.
Exactly right.
Mark, tell me about Showtime.
Well, as we know by now, Pete was a prodigious practicer. So people would look for moves they saw in practice in the game, but sometimes there would be a move that no one had ever seen before. A guy like Bud Johnson would go, "Pete, where'd you get that? I never saw that one before." He goes, "Oh, I practiced it a lot of times." "When?" He goes, "In my head." And there were moments, there were just explosions of creativity on the basketball court that no one had anticipated before. After his first game with Tulane, he did a pass between his legs that after the game, the Tulane players demanded to see again and again and again on replay in their film session because they still couldn't believe they had actually seen it. Pete's game became the subject of great debate among SEC officials because no one knew how to call a game with Pete. You didn't want an inexperienced ref because the guy would sit there and swallow the whistle in awe.
Pistol Pete's Basketball Diaries are brought to you by the official Pistol Pete website, Pistol Pete 23. Go to Pistol Pete 23 and learn more about the legend.
Want to learn more about Pistol Pete? Read Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich by best-selling author Mark Kriegel, a book critics are calling mesmerizing, transcendent, and sensational. Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich, wherever books are sold.
No one knew how to call a game with Pete. You didn't want an inexperienced ref because the guy would sit there and swallow the whistle in awe. Sophomore year, Pete had a move. He waves his hand over the ball and passes the other way. Ref calls him for a travel. Pete stops and says, "How could you say I was walking? You've never seen that move before."
I tell you, there's such a thing as a law averages. Pistol will have to cool off pretty soon because he has not missed too many shots this season.
I think he defies that law and a few others sometimes. Maravich. Boy, he's got all kinds of moves. What move does this guy have, Kel? Up front to Jimmy McMillan. He drives. Off the glass, no good. Coleman rebounds. That was fine defense by Maravich. Another steal.
I don't know how you stop him. He is too much.
Kel, I don't know about you, but I'm running out of things to say about Maravich.
Mark, Showtime is a harbinger of things to come in basketball.
Yes, it is. And it's a manifestation of Press's vision, again. But looking at it from today's perspective, I'm not sure people really understand what a departure it was back then. The ideal for a college athlete was still Bill Bradley, a guy who made an art of blending in. Bill Bradley was loath to call attention to himself, but everything about Pete's game was flagrant, was funky. It demanded to be seen. There was nothing subtle about Pete's game.
It was center stage.
It was center stage. But Bradley, the Rhodes Scholar, the model student athlete from Princeton, was really a very, very practiced, accomplished player. But that's the guy your father wanted you to be. But the guy you wanted to be at that time, if you were a kid at that time, was Pete. It was still a game controlled very much by a basketball establishment. There was no dunking. Remember, the dunk was outlawed. It was not a game that placed a premium on expression or self-expression. I spoke to Wooden about this, and he said, hey, if one of my players passed between his legs or behind his back, he knew where he'd be, right on the bench with me. And that was the antithesis of what Press was putting into practice with his own son. It's once again, you have, Wooden and Press, they each respect each other immensely. And this is at the time when Wooden is using Press's offense, the
high-low.
The high-low. Pete is really a sign of things to come. And the whole emphasis on self-expression and Showtime is really where the game is going. Well, that's a
Surrounded by-
problem. It's a big, big problem because basketball is still
An
a
ensemble.
team sport.
That's correct.
Also, the guy averaged 44 points a game. I don't think that record will ever, ever, ever be broken. First of all, I don't think anyone's staying in school that long.
That's correct.
But beyond that, to shoot that much is an almost impossible task. Pete was given a kind of crazy mission to score that many points. But I don't think that people really understand what type of endurance it takes to shoot that much. Now, Pete took a little time off on the defensive end of the court, but it was almost imperative. He had to do it. There's no way he could keep that up.
Did he ever get taken out of the game?
Not often. He was a tough kid on the court. Going back to freshman year, he takes a big gash, takes 12 stitches over an eye, comes back to the game, hits a winning shot. He wasn't a big kid, but he was a pretty tough kid.
What were the fans expecting to see? They were expecting to see Showtime.
Well, think about the pressure of expectation here.
Yes.
If the kid scores 43 points, he's had a bad game. Tennessee had played
Yeah, he had
really
bad games against Tennessee.
But Tennessee played him well. But it was a boxing 1, a boxing 2, a boxing 3, and then when he's not looking, beat him down. Harold Sylvester, who played for Tulane, said, we beat on him a lot, and it still didn't keep him down.
Yeah, and you couldn't play him left, you couldn't play him right, you just couldn't keep him
Well,
down.
the famous story is Tom Nasalki, who later winds up as his coach in the Jazz, is then the coach at Tulane, and he says, make him go left, make him go left, make him go left. He went left for about 55.
That's right.
Yeah.
He held him down at 55.
People forget that these scoring feats of his were absolutely Ruthian. The second half of a game against St. John's in Hawaii, holiday tournament, St. John's scores 39 points. Pete scores 40. Lou Carnesecca, who is one of the great saints of New York basketball, calls it the greatest 15 minutes he's ever seen on a court.
You know what he said?
scores 69 against Alabama.
Carnesecca said, I believe, that he did a very poor job of coaching in the second half because he was watching Pete play.
Just like Press, he became a fan. And that's what Pete did to even the most, grizzled coaches. He turned them into fans. Now, when Carnesecca goes back to New York, he starts singing Pete's praises. He's comparing him favorably to Oscar Robertson and Jerry West. Carnesecca's coming back saying, this kid's better. This kid's worth all the money you could pay him.